I'd like to really introduce our next speaker, Dr. Christopher Boone. He's the Dean of the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. His research contributes to ongoing discussions in sustainable urbanization, environmental justice, vulnerability, and global environmental change. He is currently co-principal investigator for the urban long-term ecological research projects based in Baltimore and Phoenix, both projects supported by the National Science Foundation. During Dr. Boone's academic career, he has been principal or co-PI on research grants totaling $26 million. For the past 3 years, he has sat on scientific steering committee for the Urbanization and Global Environment Change Project, a core initiative of the International Human Dimensions Program. And he's also participated in the U.S. Global Change Research Program's U.S. National Climate Assessment for Cities. He is an active contributor to Future Earth, an international initiative that aims to integrate the global environmental change community with a focus on sustainable outcomes. Dr. Boone is author of 2 books on urban sustainability, City and Environment, and Urbanization and Sustainability. He is associate editor for current research on cities, and he serves on the editorial board of the International Journal of Sustainable Development and Environment Justice. He has his PhD from the University of Toronto and served as a postdoc fellow at McGill University. He has really conducted some groundbreaking work on park and park inequities in Baltimore, and is currently conducting a similar process in Phoenix. And I think he'll be telling us a lot less about the technical aspects of that work, but more about the process that he went through. And I think that that will be very enlightening. He's obviously willing to go into any aspect of it through question and answer. So please join me in welcoming our second furthest traveler to the symposium. And we welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
So first of all, I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me out of the valley of the very hot sun. It's nice to be back in Los Angeles. I used to live here in the mid-90s. So the title of my talk is really the take-home message of the presentation that I want to give today. I think too often when we look at park equity, we tend to be focused on outcomes and distribution. But I think what tends to get ignored is the process. The process, I would argue, is as equal, if not more important, than the outcome when we're looking at issues of park equity. And I'll talk more about what that means in a moment. But again, the abridged version is that if we are going to work to strive for park equity, we need to make sure that the ends don't justify the means. Unless you're Machiavelli, then that's fine, but I think most of us in here probably are not. So we need to make sure that the process of creating that equity is fair in itself. So that means involving stakeholders. That means giving people a voice who have been typically marginalized from that process. Because if we don't, then I don't think we're going to achieve what I consider to be a just situation. So here's my 5 points that I'm going to make. Now I'm going to be talking to you primarily about Baltimore. You'll see a couple of slides on Los Angeles because I've done some work here many years ago, as I mentioned. But I'm going to tell the story of Baltimore because there are some similarities to what you've seen in Los Angeles, but there's also some important differences. And I think when you look back retrospectively at the processes that created the modern urban landscape in Baltimore, it's really important to understand why what looks like on the surface and in a snapshot to be an equitable outcome is actually based on a long history of injustice. So when we do that snapshot, what you're going to see is that African American and high need populations have better walking access to parks than white, and there's a very small Latino population in Baltimore. But what you will find is that they have lower per capita access to acres of parks than others. Okay? So that's the distributive outcome finding. This is, in spite, as I've just hinted about, is in spite of a very long history of disadvantage for African Americans, and I'm going to go into depth on that. What I argue in the paper that I think most of you have, and that I'll argue today, is that the patterns that we see in the present are very much an inheritance. And we heard one of the speakers this morning talk about inheritance and what that meant for park equity. In the case of Baltimore, for African Americans, that meant inheriting formerly white spaces out, so that meant inheriting better access to parks. So the points 4 and 5, which I can't stress enough, is that when we look at these outcomes, it can't just be the outcomes that are just, but they have to be justly achieved. And I think there's an opportunity when we do these kinds of analysis to use it as a basis for arguing for righting past wrongs. So we can't forget that history. We can't erase it. We need to think about how we can use that history for good. If you're not familiar with Baltimore, the city of Baltimore is set in the context of a 5-county area that makes up metropolitan Baltimore. Baltimore itself is a majority African-American city and has been since about 1970. There's about 622,000 people. Unfortunately, that number continues to shrink. Its population has been declining since about 1950. The metro area is actually relatively wealthy compared to the city. Places like Bethesda that are closer to DC are a world away from parts of Baltimore. But the important point I want to make here is that when we look at the city of Baltimore, it is today primarily an African-American city. The economy has fallen out in many ways. Baltimore was an industrial powerhouse, and when you look at the planning documents from the 1930s and 40s, it projected Baltimore being a city of 1.5 million people and just continuing on uninterrupted. What it didn't foresee was the deindustrialization of the economy and some other factors that I'll talk about in a moment, which meant a net reduction of 100,000 jobs in manufacturing. These are good, middle-class, well-paying jobs. So the population has been in decline, and this is important to remember because there are implications for the tax base, there's implications for the production of vacant properties and so forth. Now with the demographics, I'm going to show you what's happened with African-American populations from 1940 to 2000. And two things that I want to point out. Number one is that African-American populations in Baltimore have always been deeply segregated from white neighborhoods. So West Baltimore and East Baltimore that you see there around the Inner Harbor have been the classic African-American neighborhoods since actually the turn of the century. But watch what happens as we progress in time is that these neighborhoods do grow, but they continue to be very segregated. Here's 1970. At this point, Baltimore becomes majority African-American, 1980, 1990, and 2000. So there's been suburbanization of African-American populations. We tend to think of white flight as characterizing neighborhoods around, or I should say counties around Baltimore, and that was certainly the case early on, but there's also been middle-class black flight as well. So this is important to remember too, and we'll come back to this slide later on. So in environmental justice, where I do most of my work, or most of it's framed, there really are two components that are important to understand. The first is what we call distributive equity or distributive justice. And this goes to what I think most park equity plans tend to focus on, is they try to measure whether or not the distribution of a good thing or a bad thing is uneven and whether some social groups are disproportionately burdened or benefit from it. But equally important is the idea of procedural equity or procedural justice. So it's the processes that create these outcomes. Are they just? Are they fair? So in the case, and I'll just use one quick example to demonstrate why that's important. So in the case of Los Angeles, which is really where I got my start working in environmental justice in the mid-1990s, Los Angeles is a classic environmental justice case where these little triangles represent facilities where toxins are released into the air, land, and water. So think of them as polluted neighborhoods. And the shaded polygons or areas that you see there is a percent Hispanic by census block group. And it doesn't take fancy GIS to recognize a pattern here, right? So in those areas where you find toxic facilities, you're much more likely to find Latino populations. And if you do the statistics, what you do find is that even if you control for income, you're more likely to find a toxic release inventory site in a Hispanic neighborhood than in a white neighborhood. And so what I did after we ran these analyses is, again, I want to know, well, how did this come to be? So what were the forces that created the modern landscape that we see in Los Angeles? And so I focused in on East LA, where there's a really strong cluster around Vernon, City of Commerce, and I zoomed in on the City of Commerce. And if any of you are interested in reading that paper, I'm sure I can dig it up from the dusty archives somewhere. I'd be happy to share it with you. But what I did in that paper is, okay, how is it that this area, the City of Commerce, ended up being such a concentration of these toxic sites? And I think there was a number of historical factors that come into play. And what's interesting here, and this is a really important point that I make to my students all the time, is that we tend to think of cities as these really dynamic places that are always changing, right? Everything's super fast, hyper fast. But there are some things that decisions sometimes that are made in the past that have an amazing staying power. So decisions in this case that were made in the 1920s about how to zone Los Angeles County continue to affect the distribution of where pollution is today in 2010, 80, 90 years later. And we see that in Baltimore, see that in other places that we've studied as well. So here, when just talking about a few processes, I'll touch on these lightly, but there's deep literatures around all three. The first is the idea of environmental racism, and this was raised very early on in the environmental justice community, because when these patterns were found that it wasn't income that was the best explanatory variable, but whether or not you were black or Hispanic or another minority population, people said, well, what's going on here? Is there deliberate intent to locate toxic facilities, polluting facilities in minority neighborhoods? And there's been a lot of discussion about that and what it means, where the burden of proof lies and so forth. But what I was focusing here in City of Commerce, what I was focusing on was that there are certain institutions that if they weren't overtly racist, in many ways they were discriminatory in the way they thought about surrounding populations. So in East LA, in post-World War II, these were agricultural fields. So largely, most of the fields were Asian Americans were growing food, but they're surrounded by Mexican American and Mexican populations. And when the County of Los Angeles, which is one of the first counties in the United States to come up with a zoning plan, typically this is done within cities, when they started thinking about, okay, where can we start to designate the industrial areas of Los Angeles because we need industry, they created this map that you see here on the right-hand side, and they only chose one. The only place they chose to be industrial was East Los Angeles, around the City of Commerce. And if you look at the literature that was associated with that decision, there were some very racist notions about what Mexicans and Mexican Americans were able to do. So that was certainly built into the decision. But a third concept which is important, and I think your second speaker, Laura Polito, couldn't make it, unfortunately, right? But Laura Polito was really influential in an article that she published in 2000 where she focused on the idea of white privilege. And what this idea basically says is that even if there isn't discriminatory intent against minority populations when they cite these facilities, why is it that we see a lack of these facilities in white neighborhoods? Why do they get deflected from primarily white neighborhoods? And this she called the idea of white privilege. That's almost unspoken, but yet understood as being a really powerful force. And I think this is a really important concept when we're trying to explain what happened in the City of Commerce. So we didn't find West LA being zoned as industrial. We didn't see Beverly Hills or parts of the valley zoned as industrial. We saw East Los Angeles. So that's a very short, abbreviated version of why it's important to understand that these things have a history, and those histories can be really, really persistent and really powerful in explaining why we end up with what we do today. Okay, is everyone with me on that? Okay, great. You're better than my students. All right. So let's get back to Baltimore. So if we look at the distribution of parks in Baltimore, it varies, of course, as you would expect. Landscapes are uneven. And in general, the suburban counties tend to have more park acres per capita than Baltimore City. So Baltimore City has 7.6 acres per 1,000 population, whereas some of the other surrounding counties have as high as 47, for example, in Carroll County. Now, some people will talk about the National Recreation Parks Association recommended ranges of about 6.5 to 10 acres per 1,000 population. That's not used as much anymore, but at least that gives us a rough guide to what people, what a national organization at one time thought was kind of a minimum number of park acres. So everything, everywhere in the Baltimore metropolitan region that is pretty much covered. If we look quickly at differences between Metro and the city of Baltimore, and I threw up some numbers here from the city of Los Angeles. These may be wrong. I know I have a lot of experts sitting out there, but I took these from Jennifer Woltz's paper. We can see that when we're looking at metropolitan Baltimore, that includes those suburban counties, the park acres per 1,000 is about 22.5. For the city of Baltimore, it's 7.6. And for the city of Los Angeles, about 5.2. Okay, just to give you a sense of perspective. So park equity, the speakers this morning covered this already, but there's been a lot of literature and growing literature on how we can measure it, what park equity means, what the term equity means. So thank you for covering that as well, Lisa, this morning, what equity means, because people get confused about that. So there's a lot of literature that I drew on in order to do our study in Baltimore. If any of you are interested in the process, we started off by using geographic information systems to try to measure what populations had access to parks using what's, I think, becoming quickly a standard of 400 meters or a quarter mile, this walking distance to parks. And there's lots of reasons why that walking distance is important. You mentioned this morning, or someone mentioned this morning, about the obesity crisis, and there's excellent literature from public health demonstrating that if people do have walking access to parks, they're much more likely to get the minimum amount of daily required activity. You can talk about it as a right and as a resource. So there's lots of reasons why being proximal or close to those parks is important. I can go into the details of that if you're interested, but basically what we did is that once we found out what neighborhoods did have walking access and what didn't, we compared the demographics. And for neighborhoods, we used the census definition of census block groups, okay, for those of you who are taking notes on the GIS component. All right, so there's a couple of things that we were interested in. One was just simply having access to any kind of park. And this could be anything from a pocket park to a gigantic park with lakes and boats and everything else. Now, it's important to do that in two ways, because for some people, having access to a pocket park is just as important to having access to a park that has walking trails and so forth. Many times pocket parks are used more intensively, bring communities together in ways that some of the larger parks don't. On the other hand, I do think having access to a certain amount of park space is an important justice issue, and clearly that was something that was brought up by the speakers this morning. However, what we do find when we look at simple access is what we wouldn't expect from the environmental justice literature, and that is that neighborhoods that are majority black or African American are much more likely to live within that 400 meter or quarter mile buffer from a park than white neighborhoods in the city, in metropolitan Baltimore. We also find that lower income people are more likely to live within walking distance to parks than others. Now, if we look at access to acres, here's a story that probably looks more familiar from the Los Angeles angle, and that is when we have neighborhoods that are majority white and majority African American, you can see that there's quite a disparate difference. For neighborhoods that are majority white, that figure rises to 53 acres per thousand population. For majority black, greater than 75%, that's 12.75. So there's clearly inequity there. There's other ways to measure park access and access to park acres. This is actually a technique that was developed by Chona's sister. Someone mentioned her this morning. Chona was a student here at USC. She graduated with her PhD and ended up in Phoenix and came to visit me one day in my office and told me what she did. And I said, "You're hired." So she was great. She was a fantastic resource. And so she developed this method called, basically, it's a congestion measure of how many people within an area that's to their closest park are there per park acre. So it gives us another way of measuring just how many people might potentially be all competing for the same amount of park space. And when we do this kind of analysis, we find what we found with the last analysis that I showed you, that it's primarily in white neighborhoods where we have the least park congestion, and African American neighborhoods we have the most. However, again, going back to the initial point, walking access to parks is stronger for African Americans than white neighborhoods. So here was the pattern finding. There was a lot of analysis that went behind this, but here, in essence, is what we found, is that African American neighborhoods have better access to parks, but potentially more crowded parks than in white neighborhoods. All right, so I could leave it at that, and we could walk away and say we're done. But I'm never satisfied with that. I always want to know, well, why? Why is it that we find the pattern in Baltimore that we do today? And to that, we need to look back and spend a little time doing some historical work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of creating parks for Baltimore. In East Coast cities, the challenge of creating parks as they became more popular in the late 19th century and especially early 20th century with the City Beautiful movement is that many of those cities were already built out. So we think of Central Park as, well, this is great, but Central Park, when it was built in the 1830s, was actually way outside the built-up area of New York, and New York just grew up around it. So what had to happen in a lot of East Coast cities like Philadelphia and Boston and Baltimore, so the only way to create parks typically was to create existing estates that rich people lived on. They died, their relatives couldn't get along, and then somehow it ended up back in the hands of the city, or it was bequested to the city to be used as parkland. Now this is important because what it means is that when we look at the distribution of parks in Baltimore, you see a lot of these big parks and not a lot of little parks. Those big parks were former estates in the city of Baltimore, and that decreases the potential for having an equitable distribution of parks in the city. So the creation of those parks scattered throughout the city was a real challenge. Now along came this guy named Olmsted, who you're familiar with here in Los Angeles as well. So the Municipal Art Society, which was a sort of city beautification organization, but it had some nefarious things that it did as well, which I'm happy to talk about later. It hired the Olmsted brothers to come up with a plan for parks in Baltimore. And you're going to see, I'm going to show you one of LA later on. It's very similar. He was very prescient. His firm was very prescient in that they saw that things like stream valley parks made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense because when they flooded, people get out of the way, you let them flood. When the flood recedes, you go back in and you've got park space again. He also knew that it was good for filtering water and stormwater sewers. He knew that it was a sort of natural, what we now call green infrastructure plan for the city in the early 20th century. But what's also interesting is that if you look at this closely, really closely, you'll see that he actually planned a number of little pocket parks distributed throughout the city. He had a very strong equity message. He said, we need to make sure that all populations of the city have access to a park, not just these grand estates or these river valley parks. But in the end, the city said, no, it's too hard, can't afford to do it. We're just going to go with the existing estates. And this Stream Valley Park that you see here, which is Gwynns Falls River down on the southwestern side of the city, that was finally completed by an organization called Parks and People, who we partner with about 5 years ago. So they finally realized his vision for a Stream Valley Park. So Olmsted had great ideas. He had equity baked into the plan. But in the end, the city just defaulted to large parks that were primarily in white neighborhoods. So Baltimore has always been a very segregated city, as I showed you. In fact, Baltimore is infamous for passing the first segregation ordinance in the city. We tend to think of places further in the south, but Baltimore was the first city in the country to pass an ordinance that separated the city into white and colored neighborhoods, right? And the reason why they did that is this gentleman that you see on the bottom left here. He was a Yale-trained lawyer, moved to Baltimore, and he bought a house beyond the color line on the wrong side of Utah Street. His house got bricked, created all kinds of havoc, so the city stepped in and said, okay, we're going to separate neighborhoods by white and black. That ordinance was replicated by several cities in the South. It was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court in 1917. Very interesting case, if there's any lawyers out there. It was a coalition of the NAACP and the National Real Estate Board. The National Real Estate Board did not want any restrictions on who they could sell to. And of course, they were later involved with a lot of blockbusting and everything else, which was a way for them to make money. Nevertheless, segregation persisted in a lot of, if it wasn't de jure, it was de facto. I talked about, or I didn't, I'm talking about it now, neighborhood improvement associations. There are similar things all over the country. These neighborhood improvement associations actually had deed restrictions built in. There's a long and sordid history of deed restrictions in Los Angeles. I've read many of the originals here in Los Angeles that restricted sale of properties to Mexicans, African Americans, and so forth. But just to list a couple of them, in Peabody Heights, which is a primarily white neighborhood, they supported the original ordinance that I told you about because they saw it as a way of keeping out Negroes and kike Jews. Mount Royal Improvement Association, they crowned as their greatest achievement was subjecting the property to the restriction of white occupancy only. So these kinds of things persisted even well past the ordinance. Now the implication for black residents of Baltimore is that they had relatively fewer choices of housing, and they were hemmed into increasingly dense populations, extraordinarily dense populations, and they were paying a lot of money for substandard housing. And the implication was that things like infant mortality were much, much higher, and other communicable diseases were much, much higher in African American neighborhoods than they were in white neighborhoods. So there are other institutional factors that made sure that segregation would remain a hard and fast rule. We've talked this morning about redlining. Well, it was actually a federal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, in the 1930s, much after the mortgage crisis that we've just gone through here in the United States. After the Depression, beginning of the Depression, a lot of people were defaulting on their loans. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was formed as a federal agency, and they worked with local realtors and they worked with local bankers to try to define where were the most hazardous sites to reinvest in mortgages. These maps were never meant to be seen by the public. They're secret maps, and in fact, they weren't discovered until the mid-1980s by Kenneth Jackson when he was working on his book called Crabgrass Frontier about the suburbanization. You can now find them now. They're easy to find. So these colors, what they represent is the red area represents what they consider to be the most hazardous areas for reinvesting by banks. And you can see the color is in red, and this was the origin of redlining that banks later took up. And so the idea here is that these neighborhoods were considered places where bankers or the federal government, if they could provide any relief, should not invest. So what criteria did they use? Well, they used a number. They looked at location. So I'm just zooming in on one that was yellow, so it was considered to be declining. So in terms of some of the assets, they say it's close to Druid Hill Park. See, parks even then were considered to be an asset. But if you look at some of the description, especially the detrimental features, two detrimental features, they said obsolescence, so that some of the housing stock that I just showed you, so people crowded into tiny spaces, substandard housing, paying a lot of money, and Negro encroachment. So race was a very explicit component of how this federal government agency ended up defining places that were risky to invest in. So what happened is that there was disinvestment. This sounds very familiar to modern ears, and it was certainly familiar in the 1930s and persisted well into this century. So the implications is that African Americans, for most of the 20th century, were hemmed into places that had relatively little access to parks. And if you read reports from city parks in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, again and again they say there's a distinct lack of recreational opportunities for African American populations, for black populations in the city of Baltimore. And we actually did an analysis similar to the one we did for the present of park service areas, and we found that discrepancy was certainly in place in 1930 as well. So white populations had access to much more park acreage in the 1930s as they did down into 2000. So segregation, despite Fair Housing Act and other pieces of legislation that slowly worked to desegregate populations, these persisted. Golf courses were segregated in Baltimore into the 1950s. Sometimes they were segregated by day, so on some days blacks could play, on some days whites could play. Swimming pools were segregated well into the 1950s as well. So Baltimore went through some tumultuous years after the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, or the famous Baltimore riots. And this accelerated a process that had started earlier of white flight. So white populations had started leaving post-World War II, drawn by all kinds of subsidies, federal subsidies for suburbanization, automobiles, and everything else that we know about. But also because of continued raising rates of crime, that was hard to say. And then things precipitated such as the Dr. King riots of 1968. So going back to that slide, what it meant is, if we remember back to this map, is that yes, we continued to see continuing segregation, but that population slowly, that African American population slowly moved out and ended up occupying formerly white neighborhoods. So someone used the term this morning, inherited. So this is what happened in the case of Baltimore, is that African American populations inherited formerly white spaces. So that largely explains to me, and we argue that in the paper that you have a copy of, that that's how that increased access actually occurred. And in essence, it was through very difficult, unjust processes that this current situation arose. So to summarize that, on the process front, African Americans inherited, we argue in this paper, formerly white spaces. So what we see is, on the surface, as a seemingly just outcome, is burdened by a long history of injustice, and I don't think we should forget that. We also need to think, someone made a comment earlier about the quality of parks, and so in this analysis we treated all parks as the same. Well, in some cases the parks that were being inherited were not really great things to inherit. They were hand-me-downs of the worst kind. This is a park called Swan Park, which is on a former industrial site. Allied Chemical used to operate here, and they used all kinds of chemicals that would never be allowed for use in the modern era, at least being used in the wrong way. In the 1970s, there was a soil test done in Swan Park, and they found arsenic levels 100 times acceptable levels, 100 times. That knowledge got lost, didn't get sent to the right people, was hidden, was shelved, who knows. In 2006, the city went back, did soil tests again, and found that those arsenic levels were still at that same level. So what you're seeing here is that park being locked up. So the parks that are inherited in the case of Baltimore may not be, and in some cases are certainly not, the kind of quality that people who are living in those suburban counties can enjoy. So I think that looking at the quality of the park is as important as looking at the quantity. All right, so what can we do? So based on what you've just heard and based on your own experiences, what are some of the strategies that we can employ to try to solve this? Well, the Parks and People Foundation, who I talked about, who are nonprofit partner, they call the Olmsted Plan their unfinished plan. Right? So they still look back at this plan from 1906, and we're going to finish this thing. We're going to build in the equity components. We're going to build in all the pocket parks that Olmsted envisioned. We're going to finish all these Stream Valley parks. And in fact, they actually now call what they're aiming for is to make the parks of City of Baltimore one park. They don't want to consider it to be multiple parks. They want them all linked as a single park. You had the same situation here in Los Angeles. Olmsted planned something very, very similar for LA, which unfortunately was not carried out. Can you imagine how much different Los Angeles would look if Olmsted's vision had been carried out? I'll let you just look at that for a moment and envision what that could have been like. All right. So what can we do? Well, I talked about the importance of process. So it's really fundamental, and this came out so clearly in the presentations this morning that were fantastic, that you need to engage community if this is going to work. If you just plunk down a park, right, like a piece of green, that has no meaning, that doesn't engage local community, it's highly unlikely that they're going to be using that to the ability that that community can, that they can take advantage of it. So involving people in the decision-making, in the visioning of what it can be is really, really fundamental. So one of the things that we're doing in Baltimore, again with our partner Parks and People, is we're taking the unfortunately growing number of vacant spaces in Baltimore, thinking how can we use these as an asset. So I love that slide. What was it? The Los Angeles. Oh, yeah, that was a great slide. Lost lots. Yeah. So we're doing the same thing in Baltimore, trying to figure out how can these be actually productive spaces of opportunity. And so we have lots of community gardens, but we're also building new pocket parks and so forth. But this slide down here at the bottom, this is actually a community open house at the Baltimore Ecosystem Study. Now, imagine, this is a study that's funded by the National Science Foundation, has a bunch of scientists running around. They have a community open house that runs adjacent to this meeting. They bring in people and they hand out awards for the great work that they're doing in their community. It's a really, really fantastic event. That slide on the right is just another sense of the staying power of decisions that are made, in some cases 70 or 80 years ago. Each one of those black dots represents a vacant lot, and that's the original red line map from 1930. And there's an amazing spatial coincidence between the two. So history matters. I just want to highlight one person, Jackie Carrera. She's the outgoing CEO and president of Parks and People. The reason I'm highlighting her is because she's moving to Los Angeles. And I think you should get her contact. There's her contact information. You should contact her. Because she's great. She's a dynamo. She is fantastic. So she has been a really visionary person. I think she could add a lot and add a lot of experience from her work in Baltimore and bring it here to LA. I think she's actually traveling right now across the country, so she'll be here soon. So some other things that we've done, we've worked with schools, and schools are great. I mean, there's so many great things that come out of schools. This is Franklin Elementary in West Baltimore. Baltimore had to sign a $1 billion consent decree with the EPA because the Chesapeake Bay is such a polluted body of water. Everyone knows about protecting the Chesapeake, right? So in the city of Baltimore, you can't add any more impervious surface because that's one of the worst things you can do to worsen water quality. So if anyone wants to develop anything in Baltimore, including people around the Inner Harbor, they have to offset that with removing impervious surface somewhere else. So this is money. You're talking about money, right? Someone was talking about money. This is money that was there from developers. They take that money. They brought it to the school. Well, they actually brought it to Parks and People. Parks and People went to the school and said, what can we do with this? This, what you see here, used to be all asphalt. When this school was built in the 1960s, the idea of a perfect schoolyard was asphalt. Just asphalt the whole thing over. It's low maintenance. You can do whatever you want in it. In the end, this asphalt got cracked. They actually had to mow the asphalt because grass was growing up in between. It was just a mess. So unanticipated consequences. So, but what was really great about this is they went and talked to the kids in the 5th grade class and said, well, what do you want to do with this? Where would you like this? Where would you like us to tear out the asphalt? And they said, we want a reading circle. So this little circle in the area, that was the first thing was there. Everything else that you see that's grass used to be asphalt. So they built this little reading circle. They planted trees. And parks people said, no, the trees won't survive. It's a really bad place to put it. But kids said, well, that's what we want. So they did it. And it actually worked out well. They planted benches and everything else. But it was such a success that they're able to get more money through this fund to actually rip out most of the asphalt. So if you go to the next picture, you can see that almost all the asphalt now is gone. There's now there's a Met station there. Kids use it for science projects. And it's just one of those great stories where there's an educational opportunity. It's improving the health of the bay. It's providing community access to green space. They open this up on weekends for the local community to use. And it's a fantastic success story that we should see more of. I just want to end with a few more points. I know I've only got a couple of minutes left. Some places where I think park equity can go. We've talked about quality of parks. I think we need to think about parks not just as green spaces, but as things that can provide ecosystem services. So these are things that we take from nature as benefits to humans. So we've talked about the health virtues of parks, but there's also cooling effects. That's really important in Phoenix. It probably is here as well. Promoting wildlife, nutrient cycling. There's all kinds of benefits that we can take from green things in the city. And so what you're looking at here is actually a quick study that I did showing tree canopy cover in the city of Los Angeles. So what you see on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is a map of poverty. And again, it doesn't take a fancy GIS to tell you that impoverished areas of Los Angeles are much more devoid of tree canopy cover than wealthy areas. So we need to move beyond parks, is what I'm saying, is we need to look more holistically at the kinds of ecosystem services that we can provide in cities as a way of trying to achieve environmental justice. In the city of Baltimore, we find that where there is low tree canopy cover, the surface temperatures are way hotter. Heat kills more people than all other natural disasters combined in the United States. So it's not just an equity issue, it's a health issue, it's a health and safety issue. And those warm areas tend to be where you find basically minority and impoverished populations. So I think there's an opportunity to use this kind of analysis and this kind of thinking to try to right past wrongs, to not forget history, to know that you can use this history to actually advocate for trying to turn things around. We can't, of course, erase the wrongs of the past, but we can try to do things to try to relieve some of the wrongs of the past. So there's a tree planting program now that's, again, partnering with Parks and Rec as well as Parks and People in the city of Baltimore. We did the analysis for them. And part of what was incorporated into the analysis was equity for past inequities. So those areas that you see in red, which should look similar to some maps you've already seen, those are areas where you can plant trees, but it's also a recognition of these are neighborhoods that have been dumped on for decades and decades, and we should do something about it. So the only thing I want you to remember is that park equity, it's about process, not just, maybe I should have used only, not only income. And if you'd like to talk to me more about any of this work or how you might use it to do something similar for Los Angeles, there's my contact information. I'd be happy to talk with you. Thanks for listening. Why is it that people tend to stay, underrepresented populations tend to stay in these areas and not move out versus whites? Well, you know what's interesting is that in the case of Baltimore, it's the opposite of what you find in Los Angeles. White populations are more likely to live in toxic neighborhoods than black populations. And there's a history behind it. But it's long and involved. But basically, these were formerly industrial neighborhoods, and the people who had access to the jobs were primarily whites because they were good-paying jobs. But what's surprising is that despite the fact that people are living around what's obviously heavy manufacturing, there's a new wastewater treatment plant that went into some of these, people are remaining because it's their home. They've lived, their parents lived there, their grandparents lived there. So again, we tend to think of cities as really shifting around a lot, and they do in some cases, but in some cases there's amazing staying power, there's amazing inertia. So to them it was home, so they just stayed.
Are you familiar with any park and recreation or city, local jurisdiction that has a policy that is explicitly saying we are going to engage in compensatory equity action to reverse past inequities?
Yeah, that's a great question. City of Philadelphia comes close in their new sustainability plan, which I think, by the way, offers huge opportunities for cities to really think, one, systematically about all of these things and how to combine them, right? So not to separate park equity from tree canopy cover, from toxic neighborhoods, from walkability, from health. Sustainability plans offer an opportunity to really bring this all together. So, and the other reason why I think it's important is because sustainability is fundamentally about justice, right? People tend to think, oh, this is another word for environmentalism. It's not. That's a misnomer. Sustainability is ultimately about maintaining or improving human well-being for present and future generations, with a recognition that we need to be able to rely on what ecosystems and ecology can provide us, right? Not damaging it to the point that we can't maintain human well-being. So sustainability has that justice component already built in. So the city of Philadelphia actually, with its tree canopy goals, explicitly mentions environmental justice as a reason why it's trying to, no, it's actually parks, I'm sorry. Park equity is explicitly as a goal for the sustainability plan. Now, I don't think they use the word compensatory. They didn't go that far, but at least they're incorporating the notion of environmental justice and equity into their sustainability plans.
Are you looking at anything of time to get there, like it could be like 5 miles away, but 2 hours? I mean, is there any kind of aspect going on in Baltimore or anywhere else?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways to measure accessibility, and people use different methods. You can use, distance cost functions. So if there's a freeway in between you and the park, then obviously that makes accessibility difficult. There's other people who and I didn't bring this up, but I have slides to show a different way that I measured accessibility using a needs index. So the distance is still important, but I also include the needs of the population. So that includes children, elderly people, people without a car, and people in poverty. So that's another way to measure accessibility. So there's multiple ways to do it, and I think they're all equally valid. It just depends on the nature of the question that you're asking and what the target population is and what the priorities are. And that's actually in that paper if you want to read more about it.
What about, so like you mentioned obesity, but other health indicators that?
Yeah, so I mean, the literature is actually, I mean, park equity is a great thing to work on, right? Because it's almost like mom and apple pie. How do you object to parks? There's so many benefits from parks, right? So social capital, there's a lot of evidence to show that it strengthens communities. The health benefit, the public health, people are all over it. And it's not just exercise opportunities in the parks, but if you have a park that's accessible, it gets people walking to the park, even if they don't use the park. So, I mean, there's lots and lots of studies that have demonstrated the multiple benefits of them. Yeah.
Could you comment on any insight you might have on associations between agricultural use of parks and their involvement with the community, and how that helps, for example, pocket parks or other parks just become more, more part of the community and something that we love.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and again, it really speaks to the idea that parks are not monolithic. They can serve so many different purposes, and I don't know if you've read anything by Seth Allo. She's an urban anthropologist. She's done some really interesting work, and she wrote a great book called Making Sense of Urban Parks that you might want to have a look at. She's an anthropologist, so she goes out and she talks to people and tries to get a sense of why they're in the park and what they're using it for. And she's able to demonstrate using Prospect Park in Brooklyn how there are 6 or 7 multiple communities that use this space in very, very different ways. For some people, it's a drum circle. For other people, it's jogging solo through the wooded parts. For other people, it's a place to do cookouts. For other people, it's a place to go do community gardening. So, and of course, what she loves as an anthropologist is because it serves all these different needs, it brings together groups that might not normally communicate with one another. So certainly, I mean, the multiple use component of parks is fundamental.
Thank you so much.